Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Bald Explorer Live. My name's Richard Vobes, and I shall be reading Chapter 2 from J.B. Priestley's 1933 book, An English Journey. And it says on the cover here, or on the inside, English Journey, being a rambling but truthful account of what one man saw and heard and felt and thought during a journey through England during the autumn of the year 1933. And I think the thing to remember, and I didn't really point this out, was there was the Great Depression, of course, and it was just prior to the Second World War. And it's 90 years ago that he made this journey. And I just thought it would be an interesting thing to do as we're all locked in, many people not having much to do, perhaps got a bit bored with television and the usual doom and gloom. So I thought it would be just a bit of fun to take our minds off things. I'm making myself a nice cup of tea, which somebody commented that I was a milk in first person. And that's interesting because I think tea has to have boiling water on it to infuse properly and then to steep. And that's when you add the milk. And there's that debate about when do you put the milk in. Well, if the boiling water is already on the tea leaves in the pot, when you pour it, you can put the milk in first, I believe. But if I'm using a tea bag, I'll pour the water in first onto the tea again, which is what I've done in a pot, and then I will add the milk afterwards. So I just thought I'd clear that up. Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all well. Thank you for coming and joining me. I hope you can hear me okay. And I'll get started because it's quite a lot to do. I should be around about 45 minutes, something like that. I'm not going to read, in fact, the whole chapter because it does waffle on a bit. I will pick up tomorrow where I left off. Hopefully, I'll read this a little better than I did yesterday. So, but yes, thank you. Good morning, and I am well. One sugar and milk. Okay, Laura, no problem. I may well pause. I was losing my voice yesterday, so I may well pause just to slurp on my tea and keep my my voice and my throat oiled. Of course, I seem to have now just got water or something on the desk. Right. So let's crack into it. Don't need that now. So this is Chapter 2, J.B. Priestley's English Journey. Chapter 2, to Bristol and Swindon. I'll just adjust my glasses. And if you remember, or you haven't heard the first one, J.B. Priestley is taking a journey through England. He starts in London and he goes down to Southampton. And then from Southampton, he's decided, well, we'll see what he's decided. Bristol seemed a good place to visit after Southampton. There are 2 or 3 motor coaches that run between Southampton and Bristol, and I chose the earliest one. But I was before my proper time, and the bus was very late, so I had a long hour to spend at the starting place, a large yard with waiting rooms, booking offices, a refreshment bar, and a newspaper kiosk in it. All this was new to me. I'd never realised before how highly organised this road travel is, with its inspectors and inquiry offices and waiting rooms and what not. Perhaps because it was so early, and also because it was still a damp morning with no sight of the sun, there were very few other passengers waiting, though the coaches were ready to take you anywhere between Plymouth, Birmingham and Brighton. We were a small and rather dismal company, as yet only half alive. I ordered a cup of tea from what seemed the smallest and youngest waitress I'd ever seen, for she looked 8 years of age and about 40 inches high. Possibly she was older and taller, but this is certain. She didn't know how to make tea. This was the third lot of tea I'd had that morning, for I'd had some on waking and then some more at breakfast, and I told myself, as I waited for the brown speckled mess to cool, that the East had contrived a subtle revenge on us, its chief plunders, by turning us into tea tippers who could not even know a good leaf when they tasted it. We English comfort ourselves with the sweepings of the East. Nowadays our national drink is bad tea. Beer is as far out of date as honest John Bull himself. The maids in our kitchen drink tea all day long, and the difficulty is to get them away from bread and butter and tea, Shelley's favourite drink, I believe, and make them tuck into some solid food. Their menfolk are as bad, and no longer regard tea as womanish stuff. We're all floating somewhere on a full tide of tea, not the clear, almost sparkling infusion, but a murky stew made with water that either never came quite to the boil or had been boiled, but boiled out of all freshness, in a teapot that was not allowed to recover from its last dark brew. God only knows where we're bound, but the tannin inside us does not encourage us to feel too hopeful. The most conspicuous object in my neighbourhood as I sat there, tea in hand, waiting, was a gigantic map poster in blue and green that said, "You are now only 12 miles from the lovely Isle of Wight." And so I spent some time thinking about the island on which I'd stayed for the very first time that very summer. Certainly a lovely island, at least when you leave Cowes, Osborne, Rye area, which has little charm. The rest of it is English South Country at its best in miniature, Lilliputian downs and all, with its island quality added, a lightning touch on the horizon which in every direction you look. Tennyson is the poet, Victoria is the queen. The little towns on the east coast still seem a little dazed by the passing of the Prince Consort. That Victoria herself should have died there is so right and proper that you can use the fact in a teleological argument. The island population, including the summer yachtsmen and all the deckhands and stewards and other men who have to play with the yachtsmen, consists chiefly of an amiable and slow peasantry, not to be hustled but said to be good in a crisis, and elderly gentlefolk tucked away in charming old manor houses or converted farms. These gentlefolk watch the decay of their incomes and keep open house for young male relatives on leave from the East. If you wish to study the English countryside of the more genteel novelist, you can have it neatly arranged and spread out for you on the Isle of Wight. There is not much bad poverty. There is not much bad poverty there, even now, and a good deal of homely enchantment. The downs, high above the channel, the sub-tropical undercliff, well away from Farringford, but very close to the landscape of Tennyson's poetry, sunset and the needles, rooks in the old elms, and the spring, bright with daffodils, that has always haunted English poetry. There are also Cowes and its Royal Yacht Squadron, and the less exclusive Parkhurst Prison, to which, if ever I'm given a few years, I hope to be condemned. The island would make a superb national park, of the American kind, but then I suppose if you compare it to the real England of our time, it already is one. And there it was, on a poster map, and I stared at it as I tried to drink the tea the tiny waitress had spoilt for me. The motor coach was late, and when it arrived, it was empty. 4 of us climbed into it, a young mother with untidy black hair and her little boy, both eating far too much chocolate. A young man whose luggage announced that he had just arrived from Canada and was wearing very light trousers and an odd white pullover, perhaps a new Canadian national costume. And myself. It would be useful at this point to pretend that the passengers immediately burst into amusing or informative talk, but truth compels me to say that only the small boy talked. He never stopped, and the rest went silently into our seats, which were so elaborately comfortable that we sank into them almost out of sight and sound. Smoothly, powerfully, the coach went down a long straight road that led from Southampton to Romsey. I'd not troubled to have a look at it before. Quite rightly too, for this road, with its new lock-up shops, its picture theatres, its red brick little villas, might have been anywhere. It is the standard new suburban road of our time, and there are hundreds of them everywhere, all alike. Moreover, they only differ in a few minor details from the few thousand such roads in the United States, where the same toothpastes and soaps and gramophone records are being sold, the very same films are being shown. The sun was now breaking through a fine spread of cloud. Over on the left, mile after mile, went the line of the New Forest, and its sombre crest of foliage had the same solid, heavy-shadowed look that you notice in the work of the old landscape artists. It lay there half in gloom, half smiling, this forest I had never entered, like a piece of time that no clock of ours could tick away. Very close to my imagination, which had played with its name and associations, but as remote from the ordinary busy self of me as the jungles of Orinoco. I believe most of my pleasure in looking at the countryside comes from its more vague associations. Clamping the past onto the present, turning history and art into exact topography, makes no appeal to me. I don't care where the battle was fought or where the queen slept, nor out of what window the poet looked. But a landscape rich in these vague associations, some of them without a name, gives me a deep pleasure, and I could cry out at the lovely thickness of life, as different now from the ordinary existence as plum pudding is from porridge. It is the absence of these associations, these troops of pleasant ghosts from history and art, that makes a new country in which nothing has happened, like some of the great tracts in America, appeal so empty and melancholy, so that a man has to get drunk there to feel his imagination stirring and rising. The Hampshire, whose gilded fields and deep blue shadows were all about me that morning, had this power of quickening and enriching the mind with associations, now reminding me of the old landscape artists, now of Hazlitt, now of the medieval England that must have looked like this through county after county. And so the journey turned into a most pleasant and satisfying experience. It reached its peak when we crossed the spur of the Downs, looked down, looked into the distant vale, and saw far away in the autumnal haze the spire of Salisbury Cathedral, like a pointed finger, faintly illuminous. This is a noble view of England, and Constable himself could not have contrived a better light for it. You have before you a Shakespearean landscape, with shreds of Arden all about, glimpses of parks of Navarine, and Iranian distances. Not sure I read that right. So we descended upon Salisbury. Once in the city, I couldn't see the cathedral, but I saw the Labour Exchange, and outside it, a pitiful little crowd of unemployed as ever I've seen. No building cathedrals for them, poor devils. They would think themselves lucky if they were given a job to help to build rabbit hutches. We ran into the big square into which coaches like ours were coming from all quarters and anchored off Oatmeal Row. Let's have another slurp of tea. Hope you're enjoying this. Here, we changed passengers, but I had no better luck, for the new lot consisted of 5 mousy women of various ages, of the kind who never speak but in whispers when travelling, and always compress their lips and narrow their shoulders as if to make themselves as small as possible and so elude some imaginary pursuer. I now sat at the front seat and looked through the window as big as a plate glass front of most of the small shops. But the enchanted landscape had gone. Here was ordinary countryside. We passed a brigade of artillery on the march, and I noticed again that none but a few of the older officers and warrant officers had war medals, though it seems only yesterday that I walked through the demobilisation camp. How innocent the field guns looked, all polished and muzzled in their best clothes. As we passed gun after gun and dozens of foolish young red faces, I was asking myself when these things would next fire at an enemy, and for what fantastic cause. At the next town we made a halt of a quarter of an hour or so for refreshments. Sorry about my phone going off. For refreshments, the conductor told us, as he almost bundled us into a little coffee shop where we had stopped. The 5 mousy women crept in, whispering, and I followed them, and we were all served with coffee and biscuits by a young woman whose face was far too spotty. Another passenger joined us, a woman in black, who looked as if she were busy hating somebody, and we all started again. We nosed our way ponderously through Bradford-on-Avon, which is very different from the other Bradford where I was born and nurtured. Bradford-on-Avon is all quaint, whereas the other Bradford has nothing quaint, except perhaps the entire population. Then Bath spread herself before us, like a beautiful dowager giving a reception. Bath, like Edinburgh, has the rare trick of surprising you all over again. You know very well it's like that, yet somehow your memory must have diminished in the wonder of it, for there it is, taking your breath away again. There is a further mystery about Bath, which Edinburgh does not share, for I was never able to imagine who lives in those rows and rows of houses really intended for Sheridan and the Jane Austen characters. They all seem to be occupied. Life is busy behind those perfect facades, but who are the people? Where do they come from? What do they do? As our stay there on this journey lasted only about 2 minutes, I did nothing to settle this question, though my mind played with it again as we rolled away from these Palladian heights. After that, the road was a muddle until we came to a place where trams and coasting steamers seemed in danger of colliding, and I realised that we had been deposited neatly in the very heart of Bristol. I'm going to pause there for a moment. I just want to blow my hooter. Are you enjoying it so far? It's lovely, isn't it? I love the lovely prose that Priestley has. I think I'm reading a bit better than I was yesterday. Let's just have a look, see what comments there. Nigel Sadler, listen with the Vobes. Emily Champion, are you sitting comfortably? Marvellous, good morning. So nice to have a breeze of old England winding its way into our consciousness. Thank you, Mikey. Yeah, oh, lovely. Makes me feel cosy listening to your stories after I've been off to the local bike shop to get my bike fixed. Oh, well done. It's lovely. Actually, I'm going to pour another dollop. I will get back to the story, I promise you. Bit of milk. One wants to make the reading as English as possible as well, or at least in timely with the in having tea and stuff. I should have got crumpets, shouldn't I? Julia says, sorry, I was listening for it for a bit. Sadly, Ramaboo. Oh, I think we took the Ramaboo. Okay, fair enough. Right. This is the next bit, or the next half of this sequence. At one period during the war, I was stationed in South Devon, and when I got weekend leave from there, I usually travelled at night time to save time, and it so happened that I frequently found myself changing trains at Temple Mead Station, Bristol, always in the middle of the night, and always with 2 or 3 hours wait. Sometimes I hung around the station or wandered out into the dismal streets, and sometimes I went across to the hotel across the way and tipped the night porter so that I could have a nap in front of the dying fire in the smoke room. And this is all I ever knew of Bristol, Temple Mead Station in the dark hours, Victoria Street and the deserted smoke room at the hotel there. The natural result was that I carried with me for years a vague impression that this was an unpleasant city, and until I made this journey I never troubled to go and see what it was really like. Now I know better. A great deal better. Bristol is a fine city. They're right to be proud of it. There's another reason why Bristol surprised me so pleasantly. I was brought up in a city that was largely the product of 19th century industrialism, a place lacking in age, traditions, history, and nearly every town I saw in my youth was the same kind, groups of factories and warehouses, with quarters for working people, more comfortable quarters for cashiers and managers, a few big houses for the manufacturers and merchants themselves, and the usual sprinkling of shops and pubs, with a town hall and an art gallery in sham Gothic, and wondering what on earth they were doing there. That was the sort of provincial city that I knew as a child, with the result that it remains my idea of a provincial city. I was not surprised when I found places like Oxford and Cambridge or York and Canterbury were quite different, because, well, I expected them to be different, knowing that they were all famous museum pieces of township. But I was surprised, and still am surprised, when I find that a provincial city, comparable in size and wealth to the ones I used to know best, is not a dirty 19th century hodgepodge, not merely an extended factory and warehouse, but a real city with charm and dignity of its own. I never get it. I never get over it. I stand gaping like the barbarian I am. Bristol is not as big as Leeds, for example, but it looks 10 times the place that Leeds looks. It is a genuine city, an ancient metropolis, and as you walk about in it, you can wonder and admire. The place has an air. I knew about Bristol, of course. I knew that the Cabots had set sail from there and discovered the mainland in America, that Hakluyt, I have no idea what that is, Hakluyt had been one of its deans and Burke one of its members, that it had associations with all manners of literary folk, Chatterton, Savage, Hannah More, Coleridge and Southey. I knew that it was a famous old port, or, if you like, a vintage port, and had its cathedral and its St. Mary Radcliffe Church and its Merchant Venturers Hall and other fine old buildings. I knew for centuries that it had been a great city of the West. I knew all this and a lot more guidebook stuff. Nevertheless, knowing that Bristol is an English provincial city, somewhere the size between Leeds and Bradford, I had expected to see the usual vast, dingy dormitory. What I did see, of course, was something that would not have astonished me at all in Germany, France, or Italy, and ought not to have astonished me in England. I saw a real old city, an ancient capital in miniature. What is especially admirable about Bristol is it is both old and alive, and not one of your museum pieces, living on tourists and the sale of bogus antiques. It can show you all the crypts and gables and half-timberings that you want to see, offers you fantastic old little thoroughfares like Mary Laporte Street and Narrow Wine Street, has a fine display of the antique, the historic and the picturesque, but yet has not gone all quaint, but is real, lively, bustling city, earning its living and spreading its own and spending its own money. The merchant venturers have vanished. The slave trade, on which evil proceeds this city flourished once, is now only a reminder of man's cruelty to man. The port, depending on the shallow, twisting Avon, is only a shadow of its old self, but Bristol lives on, indeed, arrives at a new prosperity by selling us gold flake and Fry's chocolate and soap and clothes and 100 other things. And the smoke from the million gold flakes solidifies into a new Gothic tower for the university, and the chocolate melts away only to leave behind all the fine big shops down Park Street, the pleasant villas out at Clifton, and the occasional glass of Harvey's Bristol milk for nearly everybody. The docks may not be what they were, though I believe you can still hop on a tram here and straight away board a ship for America. But then Bristol has now pushed itself out to sea at Avonmouth, where the bananas come pouring in from the West Indies. It was the original West Indian trade that made this city a great port, and even now its more important industries, such as the manufacture of tobacco and chocolate, still have a West Indian flavour. Indeed, all the older part of the city, that grand muddle not far from the docks, still has a West Indian flavour. Even the pubs down there have a suggestion of Spanish Main richness about them. There seems to be more colour than usual in the bottles stacked behind the bar, and here are counters on which guineas have gone ringing. This appears, on first impression, to be a city after my own heart. True, it is having everything in its favour. The weather is glorious, very bright, and not too warm. I believe I've just staved off a cold, so I'm ready to be pleased. A few sneezes and the whole place might look black. I'm at the beginning of my journey and not tired yet, so still sanguine. Possibly for these reasons I may be flattering the place, but I repeat, so far it seems a city after my own heart. It is old, but not living in the past. It's lively and picturesque and comparatively prosperous. The place has dignity, and the people, I imagine, high spirits. It's kept its civic pride. It rejoices in the spirit of independence, of which more later. It may be the fine weather or my own optimism, but my impression of the folk here, especially the working folk, is that the females are above average in good looks and the men are above average in breadth of shoulder and stockiness. There is plenty of good West Country blood about. You could pick up a splendid revue chorus or a sound rugicide out of the nearest street. I feel that working people here enjoy life. There is not that terrible dreariness which is probably the chief curse of our provincial towns. The people are hearty creatures who like to eat and drink well and enjoy themselves. In all that old central part of the city, whose pavements seem to be crowded all day, there is robust life. The pubs are open early, the shops are doing a bit brisk trade, the wirelesses and gramophones establishments are grinding out tunes, food for the cheaper sort seems plentiful, and the crowded scene has a hearty 18th century quality, reminding you that this is Fielding's country. This would be no place to pick a quarrel in. Anyone who asked for trouble, I imagine, would soon have it from these red-faced, thick-set fellows. But the only creature I saw in bad trouble was a rat in a cage at the entrance to an alley in Old Market Street, where a small crowd had gathered to see a big fat publican bring his terrier to chase the rat down the alley, which it did to everyone's satisfaction. I should not be surprised to learn that there was still cockfighting somewhere at the end of one of those alleys. In the old days, Bristol was notoriously tough, with a reputation not unlike that of Chicago in our time. And during the Reform riots of 1831, the Bristol crowd burned down the Mansion House, Custom House, the Bishop's Palace, and the jail. If I'd stayed longer, I might have seen some trouble, for one night I attended a fascist meeting near the docks. Neither of the black-shirted young men, who looked as fierce as Mussolini himself, could make himself heard for more than half a minute at a time, because most of the audience consisted of communists, whose stolidly sang their dreary hymn, the International. I think it was that. I heard something about the rising of the masses. Why is it always the rising of the masses? I wouldn't raise a finger for the masses. Men, women and children, yes, but not the masses. And a little fat Italian kept lifting his yellow moon face to scream derisively. "There's only 4 of us here tonight," the black shirt roared, white with anger. "But you wait till Thursday. Just try it on Thursday, that's all." And I'm still wondering whether they did try it on Thursday. I do not imagine, however, that neither of these parties would have made many converts in Bristol. There may be far less unemployed here than in the cities further north, but there are plenty of men out of work. And one morning I attended a meeting of them in the Labour Hall in the Old Market Street. The room itself, a fair-sized one, used for dancing, was almost full. The men were mostly sturdy, decent-looking fellows who did more smoking than applauding and cheering. The speaker was an oldish man with very short legs, a droll face and an enormous voice. He was obviously a practised orator, and his only fault was a certain irritating trick he had of slowing up and over-emphasising unimportant remarks, probably when he was giving himself time to think. At first his audience seemed to be apathetic, but then he roared, "The class to which I belong, and you belong, our class, is nothing but a set of damnable silly monkeys." Donkeys, actually. I said monkeys, but it's donkeys. Everybody laughed and cheered at this. The hall woke up. He then went on to describe some local and rather pettifogging attempts at welfare work, which included a scheme for giving out tiny strips of land and for breeding, to his great joy and ours, of all things, rabbits. He made very artful play of this. "Radicalism!" he bellowed. "Talk about radicalism! I remember it 50 years ago. Yes, 50 years ago! And they were real radicals then. Jesse Collins, he wanted 3 acres for every man, and a cow. Now they've got 3 acres down to inches, and instead of a cow, it's rabbits." At which we all roared. "Good old Jack," some of them shouted. Evidently the speaker was known, respected and delighted in as a character. And if there's one thing that English people love, it's a character, who, once he's thoroughly established himself as such, may abuse them as much as he pleases. And this little man did, with all the power of his admirable lungs. 25,000 members of his class here in the city could attend a football match and pay their shilling each. But when the collectors and the collections were wanted for the unemployment fund, there were only a few helpers and shillings to hand. I got no hope from the present generation of the working class, the indomitable little old radical shouted at us. No hope at all. They're a lot of silly mugs. We can only work now for the boys and girls who'll make the next generation. And I hope to God they'll have more sense than their fathers that begot 'em. And he grinned down at us sardonically through the smoke, and then suddenly sat down. He was all right. The large Irishman who followed and spoke in a soft whine was such an anticlimax that half the meeting departed, and I went out with it. The middle class here seems to model itself on civic motto, virtue and industry. They are fortunately situated, for the city's prosperity never collapsed, and its benefactors, particularly the Wills family, never locked away their purses. They have Clifton to live in, and they have Clifton Down, and the grand gorge of Avon to play about in, with such places as Bath, Wells, Cheddar, Chepstow only round the corner. No wonder they all live on in Bristol. If they were suddenly dumped into Newcastle or Manchester, life would immediately begin to look a much grimmer business. They are a naturally conservative lot, apt to frown upon the occasional bit of frankness in the little theatre, which was relying on Mary Rose when I visited it. Everybody told me that the Bristol people take a lot of knowing, though I seem to have heard as much said of all the people in every provincial town or rural district. But it may be truer here than elsewhere. What is certainly true, and admirable, is that these people are proud of their city, and do not see it as some North Country people see their towns, as a place in which to make money and then sneak out of, thinly disguised as English gentlemen. The Bristol merchant remains a Bristol merchant, and for this he may be forgiven his few stupidities and timidities. This is a difficult word to say, timidities. Here is one example of the Bristol spirit in action. A few years ago, the city had 4 newspapers, 2 morning and 2 evening papers, all owned and run by local people. This would not do. Bristol became one of the campaigning grounds of the warring national newspaper syndicates. After various manoeuvres and parleys and armistices, Bristol found that it had lost its chief morning paper and both its old local evening papers. But the press magnates, who felt that everything had been satisfactorily arranged, forgot that the spirit of independence still exists in Bristol. The city saw no reason why it should be treated as if it was somebody else's back garden. The citizens decided to start an evening paper of their own. Various prominent persons canvassed for promises of capital, formed a body of directors, and then appealed to the local public for the necessary money. All manner of sums, from the workman's pound upwards, was immediately subscribed. The staff, chiefly composed of men who had been thrown out of work by the recent manoeuvres and parleys, was soon found, and a new evening paper was launched, and at once reached a circulation of 70,000. I understand that it has not yet touched its reserve capital, and it's already paid a dividend to its shareholders and a bonus to its staff. This is more than a piece of local history, it's of real national significance. It's good that the old and honoured city should defend itself so sturdily. It's good that Bristol should have its own paper, a genuine local enterprise, and not merely some mass production thrown at it like a bone to a dog. It's good that there should be real independent providential press. People ought to read national newspapers, but they also ought to read local newspapers too, for England, even now, is still a country of local government, local politics, strong local interests, and only the newspaper written and published in the immediate neighbourhood can deal adequately with such government policies and interests. It's important that people should read Alderman Smith. It's important that people should read that Alderman Smith said this and Councillor Robinson did that. It's important that they should realise what is happening in their own district. Gossip and chatter from Fleet Street is poor substitute for such information about and criticism of local affairs. Any decent provincial newspaper ought to be able to give its reader a much saner picture of the world than the popular national papers with their hysterics and stunts and comic antics. Where an evening paper is concerned, publication must, of course, always be local. But nevertheless, there is a wide difference between an evening paper published in the provinces by a Fleet Street combine and an evening paper produced by the people of the district. The citizens of Bristol had the sense to see this and the necessary enterprise to act for themselves. For this I honour them. The inhabitants of provincial towns these days are losing the habit of acting for themselves. They grumble, but they do nothing. They should go to Bristol. Among the best examples of people actuated by this civic pride are the members of the Wills family, who might easily, following the example of most provincial magnates, have taken themselves and their gigantic fortunes out of the city. But they've chosen to remain in Bristol, the city that has made their fortunes for them, and they have spent enormous sums of money in the place, especially on the university. I spent an afternoon going around the largest of the Wills factories, which is not far from the centre of the city and is an immense building. The inspection was so thorough that I feel I know all about the manufacture of cigarettes and pipe tobacco now. What surprised me was the amount of work still done by hand. There were, of course, those ingenious machines in almost every department. One of them only has to be fed regularly with cut tobacco, mile-long reels of paper, printing ink and paste to turn out cigarettes by the million. They can even make cigars of the cheaper kind by machinery, though it looks hard enough to put the cigar together using a pair of skilled hands. But the human element remains, and indeed dominates the work of the factory. Girls perform most of the tasks, whether it's feeding the machines or doing some complete manual act, such as stripping the leaf. And this great factory is a warren of girls in green, pink, brown, blue overalls, every department having a different colour. Some of the tasks are desperately monotonous, requiring the ceaseless performance of one quick action. But the girls on such work do not do it continuously. They change their jobs every hour, sometimes even every half hour. They begin their work at 7:30 and end at 5, with 20 minutes for breakfast and an hour for dinner. There is a dining room that will seat 2,400 persons, and the menu, which I examined, is varied and cheap. There is not only a medical clinic in the factory, but also a dental one. The welfare work is obviously excellent. Wages are comparatively good, and there are bonuses and superannuation schemes. I have no affection for the tobacco combine, and I rarely smoke its products, but I must say that the Wills family have provided themselves admirably as large-scale employers. They have made their millions, but not out of anybody's tears or blood. Their policy as employers has been humane and wise, with the result that their people work well and never wish to leave, even at times when other jobs are more plentiful than they are at the present. There must always be something inhuman, terrifying about mass production on a really gigantic scale to a person like myself, who only catches sight of it now and then and hardly understands what's happening through these strange machines, though I found myself having quite an affectionate regard for the busy little gadget that slipped 2 tiny playing cards into every packet of cigarettes. It looked as if it was going to be too late, but it never was. But I must confess that the final impression that this gigantic factory left me was not one of miserable slavery, not even of grim soulless industry, but perhaps the kindly influence of Nicotina herself was at work here. If we must have factories of this size, and it seems that we must, then let them run in this fashion, no matter whether it is the Lucky Wills family or the state that does the running. Not many travellers for pleasure find their way to Bristol, which is a pity, for there is much to be seen in the city, and it makes an excellent centre for excursions. My hotel was filled almost full up with commercial travellers of the more prosperous sort, and I spent my last evening there exchanging beer and whisky with 3 of them in the lounge. Through them I learned how things were progressing in the fancy goods, scent and fur trades, respectively. They were good fellows, and when the hour was late and we had given and consumed several orders, they took leave of their more sordid views of commerce, with which they had entertained me earlier, and developed a wide vision and noble sentiments of typical commercial Englishmen who were drinking late. "Trust," said one of them, the one that preferred bottled beer. "That's what you've got to have in business. Trust. You must have trust. My people give me a certain territory, send me out to represent them, and they've got to trust me, and I've got to trust them. The same with my customers." The others, too, agreed at once. "I don't want to unload stuff on them if they can't sell them," he continued, a righteous man. "I'm not like these fellows who go round once, only once, mind, and unload anything on them. No, you must have trust. They've got to trust me. Trust is everything in our business." We told him he was quite right. "But," said another, the one who had such a marvellous piece of ham for breakfast at Malvern the previous evening, "that's not all. In my opinion, you've got to have sentiment too. Yes, sentiment. Business is nothing without sentiment. I don't like doing a piece of business unless there's sentiment in it." Which was new to me, and somewhat a mysterious view, though it was certainly expressed at the appropriate time. It is odd that though there must be excellent material in the lives of these commercial travellers, for why shouldn't I mention my own trade for once? You rarely meet them in novels or plays or films, yet they would make admirable subjects for all 3, for there must be frequent drama both in their businesses and in their personal lives. Their minds must always be clouded with hope and fear, and like so many of the satisfying figures of fiction, whether Ulysses or Don Quixote, Tom Jones or Mr. Pickwick, they are forever on the move. If I ever write another picturesque tale, I will fill it with commercial travellers. But my chambermaid at the hotel had no opinion of them. She got £2 a month for looking after 15 rooms, and she did not average 10 shillings a week in tips, so regretted that she'd ever left the seaside hydro and its invalids and commercial gentlemen in the city. But she thought the city was a fine place. And that, I conclude, is the note of Bristol. If you like, its signature tune. A civic pride, a vocal civic pride so rare in these days as to be almost startling. Like most places with a mixed trade, it has been fortunate in avoiding the lower levels of depression. A sharper bout of insolvency and unemployment might possibly change its tune. As it is, it remains a city that was strong yesterday and still lively today. A city that is old, dignified, historic, and at the same time a bustling modern commercial centre. And its citizens, even if they pile up huge fortunes, do not desert it, and are prepared to stake something on its independence. I was glad to have seen it, if only because it helped restore my faith in provincial England, and as my taxi gave me a last glimpse of pleasant College Green and that old conglomeration of ships and trams near Broad Quay and Bristol Bridge. I hoped soon to renew the acquaintance. And there I will pause for today. We carry on to Swindon in the next part of chapter 2, but it's probably a similar sort of length, so I shall stop there. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for watching. I'm going to go and have a cup of tea. I have another edit to go and edit, so we have another video for this afternoon. Thank you very much for watching. I know it's just reading books, so I'm not expecting huge numbers or anything like that. I will, of course, be doing another Vobe show this evening at 8 p.m, so do join me for that. That's on the Vobe Show YouTube channel. And there'll be a video on the Bald Explorer channel as well. The channel, yep. Excuse me. There was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was. Don't forget you can phone in on the phone-in. So that's that. Anyway, thank you very much. I shall go off and perhaps have a decent hot cup of tea now, because I've only had a few slurps of that one. Do join me again. I'll be back at 9:30 tomorrow, and we'll read the next bit. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye. Bye-bye.